The HR director was already waiting outside the conference room when I arrived that morning, which was the first sign that something had shifted overnight. I'd been at Hargrove Construction for 26 years. Started as a junior structural engineer straight out of Georgia Tech, worked my way up to chief safety and compliance officer. I knew every beam, every load calculation, every federal regulation that kept our projects standing and our crews alive. I knew which inspectors preferred morning walkthroughs and which ones needed coffee before they'd look at anything. I knew where the bodies were buried, figuratively, obviously, and I knew exactly how close we'd come to disaster on 3 separate federal contracts because someone in management had wanted to cut corners. That morning, I was carrying a travel mug and a folder with updated OSHA documentation for the Riverside Bridge expansion, a $380 million public infrastructure job, the biggest in our company's history. Federal funding, state oversight, congressional visibility, the kind of contract that could define a company's legacy or destroy it. The HR director's name was Felicity. She was maybe 32, sharp, ambitious, knew enough to still believe everything she was told by people above her. She gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said my name like she was reading it off a clipboard. "Mr. Garrison," she said, "they'd like you to join them upstairs." They, not the partners, not the executive team, just they. I noticed that. The main conference room on the 4th floor held about 40 people that day. Most of my department was there. Project managers, site supervisors, 2 federal liaisons I recognized from the Riverside contract. There were faces I hadn't seen in months. People from divisions that had nothing to do with compliance. I took a seat near the middle because that's where I always sat. 26 years of muscle memory. The new CEO, I'll call him the new CEO because he'd only been in the position for 8 months, stood at the head of the table with the kind of posture that people practice in mirrors. His name was Whitfield. 41 years old, MBA from Wharton, spent his whole career in commercial real estate before the board brought him in to modernize us. He'd never managed a construction company. He'd never stood on a job site in steel-toed boots and watched a concrete pour go wrong. But he had a very good haircut and a slide deck that used the word synergy 11 times, which I'd counted during his first all-hands presentation. I didn't know yet what was coming. Looking back, I should have read the signals. The meeting request sent at 6:47 in the morning. The unfamiliar faces. Felicity's smile. But I'd spent 26 years solving problems, not looking for them where I didn't expect them. That was probably my mistake. Whitfield thanked everyone for being there. He talked about growth. He talked about the next chapter. He talked about how Hargrove needed to position itself for the future, which apparently meant streamlining leadership and eliminating redundancies. I remember watching the slide he put on the screen, a clean organizational chart with certain boxes shaded in gray. My box was gray. He didn't use my name at first. He talked around it. Certain legacy roles, positions that no longer align with our operational direction. I was watching his face when he finally said it clearly, that my position was being eliminated effective immediately, that my access credentials would be deactivated at noon, and that HR had prepared a severance package they'd walk me through privately. 53 years old. 26 years, and I found out in a room full of 40 people, most of whom couldn't look at me. You know what the strangest part is? My first thought wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about the humiliation, though I understood even in that moment that humiliation was exactly what this was. My first thought was about my daughter. She was finishing her junior year at University of Virginia and had just been accepted into their accelerated nursing program. I'd promised her since she was 12 years old that I would handle college, that she would never have to choose between the program she wanted and the debt she couldn't afford. That promise had been my quiet anchor for years. It was the thing I thought about on hard days when the bureaucracy was suffocating and the politics were exhausting. Just get to the finish line and get her through. I stood up. I didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that would have mattered in that room, and I understood that clearly. Whitfield was already moving on, already gesturing toward his next slide, before I'd even pushed my chair back. I picked up my folder, the OSHA documentation I'd been planning to file that morning, and I walked out. The elevator ride down was the longest 20 seconds of my life. I sat in my car in the parking garage for a while. Not crying, not panicking, just sitting. The fluorescent lighting in that garage had always flickered on the 2nd level, and it was flickering now, and somehow that small, familiar malfunction made everything feel more surreal. I'd submitted a maintenance request about those lights 3 years ago. Never got fixed. I thought about that for some reason. My phone buzzed twice. 2 colleagues texting the same general sentiment. "I'm so sorry, that was wrong, call me." Both people I'd worked with for over a decade. Neither of them had said a word in that conference room. I'd been at Hargrove long enough to understand that. I didn't blame them. When you've got a mortgage and kids and a 401k that's finally looking decent, you don't throw yourself in front of a moving vehicle to save someone who's already been hit. I would have probably done the same thing at 35. I drove home and told my wife. She sat at the kitchen table and listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always loved about her. When I finished, she poured us both coffee, slid mine across the table, and said, "So what do you know that they don't?" That question turned out to be more important than either of us realized in that moment. Here's what I knew. The Riverside Bridge expansion was a federally funded infrastructure project, which meant it fell under strict federal safety compliance requirements. Specifically, a set of structural review protocols that had been updated by the FHWA 18 months prior. I was the only person at Hargrove who had been through the full certification process for those updated protocols, not because I'd sought out the credential as a career move, but because a federal liaison named Okonkwo, a quiet, methodical woman who'd been doing oversight work for 20 years, had flagged the regulatory change to me directly during a site visit and essentially said, "Someone at your company needs to be certified on this, and it should probably be you." I'd done the 60 hours of training on my own time, got the certification, filed the updated compliance documentation, built it into our Riverside workflow. Then I went back to my desk and kept doing my job. What I had not done was make sure anyone else at Hargrove was certified, not because I was protecting my position. That thought genuinely never occurred to me, but because it simply never came up. It was my area. I handled it. That's how I'd operated for 26 years. When Whitfield eliminated my position, he eliminated the only person in the company who could legally sign off on the federal compliance certifications for Riverside. He didn't know that. I'm not sure he knew the certification existed. In 8 months of modernizing Hargrove, he had apparently not spent much time in the weeds of federal infrastructure law. The Riverside project had a major inspection scheduled for 6 weeks out. The kind of inspection where federal oversight teams walk the entire site, review all compliance documentation, and verify that the right certified personnel have signed off on every critical safety protocol. If that documentation isn't in order, the project gets flagged. If the project gets flagged, federal funding gets paused. If federal funding gets paused on a $380 million project that's already 2 months into active construction, you have a problem that doesn't resolve quietly. I knew all of this, and the day I walked out of the parking garage, I didn't say anything about it to anyone. Not because I wanted to watch it burn. I want to be clear about that, because revenge sounds clean and satisfying in retrospect, and it wasn't what I was feeling. What I was feeling was tired, and worried about my daughter, and furious in a way that I had no useful outlet for, so I went home, and I updated my resume, and I called my financial advisor, and I started doing the math on what the next 12 months could look like. I also, almost as an afterthought, sent a brief email to Okonkwo, not to cause trouble, just to make sure she knew that the compliance contact for Riverside had changed, and that whoever she'd been working with at Hargrove going forward would need to get up to speed. I copied the Federal Liaison Office, standard professional courtesy. That email, it turned out, was the thread that unraveled everything. The weeks after getting fired have a particular texture that's hard to describe if you haven't been through it. There's the logistical layer, severance negotiations, COBRA paperwork, LinkedIn profile updates that feel vaguely humiliating. There's the social layer, the people who reach out immediately and the people who go quiet, and try not to read too much into either. And there's the internal layer, which for me mostly consisted of lying awake between 3 and 5 in the morning, running calculations I couldn't stop running. My daughter called from Charlottesville the evening she found out. She'd heard from a family friend before I'd had a chance to tell her myself, which wasn't ideal. She was calm in a way that felt effortful. I could hear her working to sound steady for my benefit. And she said, "Dad, you built that place. They should be afraid of what happens when you're not there." I didn't want her to worry. I told her everything was fine, which was partly true and partly the thing you say to your kid when you don't want them carrying your weight on top of their own. What I didn't tell her was that I'd been contacted by 2 headhunters within 10 days of leaving Hargrove, both with leads from federal infrastructure work. My reputation in the compliance world was apparently intact even if my employment wasn't. I went to the interviews. I kept my expectations low and my options open. About 3 weeks after my last day, I got a call from Okonkwo. She was professional, as always. She asked how I was doing. I said fine. She paused for a moment and then said she wanted to give me a heads up about something, not officially, just as a courtesy, because we'd worked together long enough that she felt I deserved to know. The Federal Liaison Office had flagged Hargrove's compliance documentation for Riverside as incomplete. The required certifications were unsigned because there was no certified signatory. They'd sent formal notice to Hargrove. Hargrove's legal team had apparently scrambled to respond, claiming the situation was being corrected. The federal office had given them a deadline. How long? I asked. 30 days, she said, which, given where the project is in its timeline, is not a lot of room. I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat at my desk, the desk in my home office, not the one at Hargrove, and I thought about what Whitfield was doing in his fourth-floor conference room right now. Whether he had any idea what he'd walked into, whether anyone on his streamlined leadership team understood that you can't just send someone to a weekend seminar and get the federal FHWA certification sorted in 30 days. The training alone is 60 hours. The application process takes weeks. And there's no workaround because the federal government is not interested in workarounds on bridge safety compliance. My phone rang 4 days later. I didn't recognize the number, but the area code was Atlanta, same as Hargrove's corporate office. It was Whitfield. I'll give him credit for making the call himself rather than sending someone. He started professionally, acknowledging that the departure had been abrupt. That was the word he used, abrupt, and that there may have been aspects of my role that were not fully inventoried during the transition planning. Then he got to it. Would I be willing to consult on the Riverside compliance documentation on a contract basis to help the company get through the federal inspection? I asked him what the timeline was. He said they needed the certifications cleared within 3 weeks. I asked what the engagement would look like financially. He quoted a number. I let the silence sit for a moment and then said the number he'd quoted was roughly what I made in a month of salary, and that a 3-week consulting engagement on a $380 million federal contract with this level of urgency and legal exposure would need to be priced differently. He asked what I had in mind. I told him. Another pause. Then he said they could work with that. I told him I'd have my attorney send a consulting agreement over by end of week. I kept my voice level. I'd been practicing that for 3 weeks without knowing I was practicing it. When I got off the call, I walked into the kitchen. My wife was at the counter with a cup of tea, grading papers. She teaches 8th grade English, has for 20 years, the steadiest person I've ever known. She looked up at me. Hargrove, I said. She set down her pen. How much? I told her. She picked up her pen again, went back to her papers, and said, without looking up, invoice them on time. The consulting engagement took 3 weeks and 4 days. I worked remotely, communicated through my attorney for anything contractual, and delivered exactly what I was hired to deliver. The compliance documentation, the certification coordination, the federal liaison communication. Professional, clean, no editorializing. The Riverside inspection passed. 2 months after that, I accepted a position with a federal infrastructure oversight firm based out of Nashville. Better title, better pay, and the work itself is more interesting. I'm on the standard-setting side now rather than the compliance side, which means I'm helping write the rules that companies like Hargrove have to follow. There's a certain satisfying symmetry to that which I try not to dwell on too much. My daughter graduated her accelerated nursing program 18 months later. I flew to Charlottesville for the pinning ceremony. She walked across that stage in her white uniform, and I sat in the 3rd row of that auditorium, the same row I always seemed to end up in, and I was so proud of her I couldn't speak. She found me afterward in the lobby and hugged me for a long time without saying anything. That silence said everything. The week before I left Hargrove for the last time, the real last time, at the end of the consulting engagement, I walked to the Riverside side one morning before the crew arrived. The bridge was taking shape. Steel and concrete and the kind of careful, painstaking work that doesn't get mentioned in MBA slide decks but is the only reason the thing doesn't fall into the river. I stood at the eastern support structure and ran my hand along the rebar configuration I'd spec'd for compliance 2 years earlier. I never saw Whitfield again after the consulting engagement ended. I heard from someone later that he left Hargrove about 8 months after that. Another strategic transition, no details given. I don't think about him much. He was just a season, the wrong season, but a short one. What I do think about sometimes is the folder I was carrying that morning when I walked into that fourth-floor conference room. The OSHA documentation I'd been planning to file. I still have it somewhere, in a box in my home office. Never did get filed, at least not by me. I filed a lot of paperwork since. Every page of it still matters. I'm just the one deciding which pages now. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Standing at that eastern support structure on the Riverside site before the crew arrived, running my hand along the rebar configuration I'd spec'd 2 years earlier. The concrete was setting. The steel was true. Nobody was watching, and nobody needed to be. The work was right because it had been done right, not because someone was checking. That's the thing about integrity. It doesn't perform, it just holds. I spent a long time after leaving Hargrove asking myself whether I'd done anything wrong. Not legally, not professionally, but in the quieter sense. Whether I'd been too comfortable. Whether 26 years in one place had made me assume a loyalty that was never really mutual. I think the honest answer is yes, partly. I understood the technical landscape better than almost anyone in that building, but I'd stopped paying attention to the political one. I knew which federal regulations were changing. I didn't know which way the wind was blowing in the boardroom. That's not a moral failure, but it's a real one, and I own it. What I've come to believe, and I didn't arrive at this quickly, is that knowledge only protects you if you understand its full value. Not arrogantly, not as a weapon. But clearly, I'd built something genuinely irreplaceable at Hargrove, and I'd treated it like just another part of my job description, which meant I never made sure anyone else understood what it would cost to lose it. Whitfield didn't know what he was walking into when he eliminated my position, but in some sense, neither did I. I didn't fully understand that my expertise had become load-bearing for a $380 million federal commitment. When you stop paying attention to your own value, other people will underestimate it too, and eventually that gap causes damage. The grit part. That's what I think about when I think about those months between walking out of that parking garage and sitting in the auditorium in Charlottesville watching my daughter get pinned. The gap between those two moments was not graceful. It was 3 in the morning calculations and uncomfortable phone calls, and the particular humiliation of updating a resume after 26 years at one company. There were days I felt like I was negotiating with a version of myself that hadn't caught up to what had just happened. But I kept moving, not because I had some clear plan, but because my daughter needed me to, and because I'd spent too many years building something real to let one bad season define the whole structure. The consulting call from Whitfield was not satisfying in the way I might have imagined it, back when I was still angry. It was just a problem getting solved. He needed something I had. I named my price. He agreed. We were both professionals, technically. What mattered more to me, genuinely, not as a performance of magnanimity, was that the bridge got built correctly. There were crews on that site. There would be drivers on that bridge. The work still mattered regardless of what had happened in a fourth-floor conference room. I think that's what I'd say if someone asked me what I took from all of it. Do your work as if it matters, independent of who's watching or who's paying you, because eventually the work itself becomes the argument. Stay sharp about your own value, not for ego, but for clarity. And when things fall apart, which they will, keep your footing. Not because the world is fair, but because you'll need to be standing when it levels out again. Garrison kept his footing. The bridge is still standing. That's enough.